Hi, good morning everyone. Thanks for coming out to the talk, and also thanks to Write the Docs for hosting this amazing event for all of us to trade our wisdom and insights and experiences. So I'm here to tell you today about telling a great story in GitHub and the special power that we all have as writers. Engineers have their special powers, some of us are doing both. But I just want to make it clear, if you take anything away from this talk today, is that you have a special power and that you're able to put ideas into words, organize them, and tell stories. And not everybody has this. So in a software environment, we all belong for this reason. How many of you are managing a GitHub organization for your company? Yeah, okay. How many of you do open source because you just enjoy it a lot? Okay, great. Alright. Push the button. And it doesn't go. Maybe I need to use this. I am the queen of technical difficulties. It's not moving. Do I have to? So either on the screen. I can't push the slides. This happens a lot. Okay. Interesting. I would just push, I would just have the presenter mode and then I would have my speaker. It's nervous. The computer's nervous.
We have it about slide.
Oh, okay. It seems to be working. Can we just try it one more? All right, now it's ready. Okay. Let me just do on standby. Thank you so much. So just about Zalando, just in case you're not familiar with it. If you're American, you probably aren't. I wasn't until I moved to Berlin in 2015 and found out all about it. Zalando is a really large company. Here's some statistics to prove. And as a big company, we have a lot of open source that we put out. About me, the intro pretty much covered all the bases. I'm also an open organization ambassador with Red Hat, and we talk a lot as a group. We're volunteers around the world, and we talk about open organizations, open source, how to make collaboration, transparency happen in organizations, and open source is obviously one of the areas that we talk about a lot. So I write articles for them at opensource.com. And for our purposes, the Feed Me README's project is probably most interesting to you because it's all about what we do. You can also check out that list of resources for management and leadership docs and talks and things like that. That's the second link. At Zalando, like I said, we have a lot of open source projects. We're a very polyglot organization. We code in primary 6 different languages, so we have lots of stories to tell from all areas of the organization. And if you want a quick look, this is our dashboard. This is where our most powerful, most well-structured, most useful projects exist. We've had an evolution, so our story has been mostly from quality or quantity to quality, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes more in detail. As a storyteller and a professional writer, before I got into technology, I'm always looking for what the plot is. And so, what is the narrative? What am I seeing? Why do we have this story? Where did it come from? And so this is a sort of background that I would bring to software engineering. And so that's what I'll be talking to you about. These are the primary ideas of why is storytelling important in open source development? And then how do we end up with GitHub junkyard? So when we don't know the story that we're telling, we often see that our organizations become kind of complicated and a little messy even. And then I'll tell you how to bring sanity to your GitHub story so that the narrative is more compelling. And then finally I'll just wrap up with how documentation is really empowering. So why do I ask these questions? Like I said, I'm a writer. So my experience is where I want to know the narrative arc of a project or a compilation of ideas, or in a GitHub organization, like what we're telling to the world. The company open sources for those reasons, but also others, like usual reasons why all companies tend to do open source: personal development for the developers and other parties interested in open source, to give back, to increase the quality of the projects, to enhance the reputation of the company as a company that gives back, and also there's a recruiting element. So when I started working with open source at Zalando, I wanted to know, like, why do we develop this way? And some of my questions were like, do we know why we are developing these projects? Do we ask that question before we publish something? Is the way that we're doing this work sustainable? Is it fun? Is it kind to ourselves? And does it tell a coherent story? And I often see in our organization and others that we often don't know why we release things on the internet, and we don't always have that purpose behind a project clear. And it's not because we don't want to ask these questions, it's because we're too busy. There's a lot of time pressure in the software development context to get things out the door, to deliver what the company needs, and sometimes because of this, especially in a complex organization, the time to ask these questions about why often goes missing. There's also some elements for our own psychology that sometimes drive us to this, where I'm too busy to ask myself these questions. When we're doing open source, maybe we want to have a lot of work to show to our audience. And so there's a feeling of being important, or being delivering a lot of work. There's also an adrenaline rush of getting things out the door fast. There are these aspects of our personalities that sometimes show up in our development patterns. But this doesn't really help us because, as Levitin and other researchers note, multitasking and putting too much work on our plates actually makes us burn out, and it also decreases our intelligence. And so those big picture questions, we're not even thinking about them anymore because we're rushing around to just maintain what we've built. And so this quote from Jeff Gotthelf really gets to the essence of the dynamic that I see in software development and open source a lot, which is that everybody is too busy. And this, he says, is a cultural symptom of a lack of a clear strategy and prioritization. Jeff Gotthelf is one of the leaders in the Lean UX movement, and so as a product development specialist, he sees that what happens is that we often get so busy that we just lose sight of what we're doing. And then, as a result of this, we lose our reader, we lose our audience, because suddenly we tell these stories that aren't so clear. Again, how we get here is not because of ignorance per se, it's often because of the lack of resources, people, time, opportunities to ask these questions even, because we're busy getting things out the door. Again, prioritization. Sometimes we're narrowly focused and we only see what we're working on, and don't attach it to a bigger significance that might extend beyond our immediate surroundings or our immediate team. Sometimes we make projects that are too complex or too simple to understand clearly, or too complex to use and wrap our heads around. And also empathy, which is not an emotion, it's a skill. One of my favorite leaders in tech, Andrea Goulet of Corgi Bytes, calls it a skill that you can develop by listening and understanding, applied by perspective taking. So, stopping, thinking, listening to your audience to make sure that you're communicating effectively and that they can follow along with the story that you're telling. And this happens in open source by asking for feedback, creating clear documentation for others to read and understand what we're trying to develop and what we're presenting to them. When we don't have these things, empathy, priorities, and time and resources develop, sometimes we end up with things like this. So this is actually a highly effective collection of components and tools that Zalando continues to use. When we did a survey last year after making this, 90% of the team really wanted to keep this. I won't go into detail about what it is because it's not very important to our needs, But it's extremely important for the teams to work autonomously and also comply with all the regulatory requirements that as a public company we have to adhere to. But for an open source project, if you don't know Zalando, you don't know our work. If you look at this and you're like, okay, you know, you have to install all of that and to use it, you know, you're going to maybe not do that because it's like, what is this telling me? How do I make sense of all of these different components? How do I know that all of them are things that I need? Now, of course, documentation helps the reader, the audience, the developer, when, you know, looking at this project to get a sense of that. And in this case, the team actually did write the docs. So this is the front page of the documentation for the collection of tools and components that you saw. However, with so many different parts, and not enough, they didn't have a technical writer, so you know, it's very quickly these docs get outdated. And when we did that user story among our team, we found that a lot of the people that we were working with weren't even sure how to install and start getting this stuff running. They would have gaps, blockers, deployment might take a lot of time, you know, some things were missing, so it wasn't a seamless experience at all. Also, the naming of these components was a bit alienating because they're all named after Zalando private fashion labels. So you don't really get a sense of what they actually do. When something is called Pier 1 or Your Turn or Senza, which is Italian for without. So it's like, I don't really know what without does. So while my colleagues who created that complex sea of components did the docs, we usually don't write the docs. So this is where we get into huge problems. And this is Joe Armstrong, one of the co-creators of the Erlang programming language, who says, you know, verily, verily, I say unto you that they that writeth the code but forgetteth the documentation shall roasteth in the fires of hell. And here's the guy who's saying, yes, agreed. In the recent GitHub survey of open source, 93% of 5.5 thousand respondents said that incomplete and outdated documentation was a pervasive problem. However, only 60% rarely or never contributed to the documentation. So while we see there's a problem, many of us don't fix, you know, our priorities, again, maybe go to the code or something else, but not to the documentation where we're telling our stories. And this costs us a lot. Opportunities, users, contributors, even quality. So sometimes when we have people who will write the docs for us, we don't even avail ourselves of these resources. And this I find mind-boggling. So this is Feed Me, Read Me. It's the project mentioned earlier in my intro and the intro from the speaker, the MC. This is a project that I started with Rich Bowen of Red Hat. We were having a conversation at FOSDEM, and we thought, well, because of the need for better READMEs, like, why not just see if offering help would help solve that problem? And so this project went live in February. I've written a blog post about it. And to date, only 21 projects have submitted their READMEs for free editing help and project analysis, which I find kind of amusing and sad as well. It's not the hype, documentation is not the latest hotness, but it's a bedrock of our development culture, and we need to pay attention to it. So I find it kind of strange that we don't ask for the help that's offered. And this is, I think, one of the critical pathways to how we end up with projects that we don't use, that die, this lack of attention to documentation. So now I will get to GitHub junkyards, which is like what we see happening in GitHub organizations when the quality is not present for our projects to sustain themselves, and no one knows how to use the stuff that we build because we don't write the docs. So a little bit about Zalando. We actually ended up with a pretty big GitHub junkyard about 2 years ago. And part of this is cultural. So for most of the company's history, it was very command and control. And developers weren't really encouraged to do any open source development at all. What we did develop was along the lines of Python infrastructure tooling, a little bit of Java stuff, some Postgres tools, but there were not many projects at all. In 2015, there was a tech management strategy shift to a model that was more based on Daniel Pink's drive, emphasizing autonomy, mastery, and purpose. The autonomy part is really complicated because if it's misconstrued, it can mean that like we could just do whatever we want and we're autonomous. So let's release what we want on GitHub. And while we were rolling out this idea of autonomy, we were rolling out a bunch of other things like microservices, an agile shift, emphasizing agile more than before. Also encouraging open source development, kind of without any guardrails. Choosing the stack, so get all creative and use whatever tools and languages that you'd like. And so what happened was that the teams went off and just kind of released everything during 2015, so about the 9 months after this strategy shift to the more autonomy, mastery, purpose model. And we ended up with about 400 projects by the end of December 2015. And there was no strategy to hold all of this stuff together. We started an open source guild, so it was head of platform engineering and me, and we created a set of guidelines that were shared among the teams, but we, while we might have signed off on them, a lot of the teams didn't actually practice them. So when the docs that we had, or the guidelines said, write docs, we often didn't do that. Or make sure that your licensing file is correct, make sure that you're inviting contributors. We all had the idea that we should do these things, but in practice we often didn't do them. Again, I think because of the time aspect and the rush to get things out the door. So there's also this compulsion that I noticed. So I became open source evangelist in 2016, and so one of my first tasks was to sort through all of this stuff and figure out what we were doing. One of the things I noticed right away, it seemed like there was this compulsive rush to publish. So there were maybe 5 to 10 repos going online per week in the initial part of 2016. And I just, I've unpacked some of this since, and some of the ideas driving this need to publish without asking why I publish this stuff is whether it's a belief that when it's on GitHub it's done, and it's valuable and it's open source and there you go. The code is enough, so documentation and all these other bells and whistles are just kind of marketing. Quantity is more important than quality. Someone else will release this first, so we better do it now. I use it, so it must be useful to everyone. The lack of time to really understand what the purpose of this thing is that we want to get out the door. And also lack of confidence, kind of not paying attention to the documentation and bells and whistles, because I think there's like an innate belief that maybe the code is just enough, and that, like, the audience won't ask for more from us. They'll just copy paste our code and there we go, we're done. And then I think this is again about missed opportunities, because maybe there's something really strong and powerful in this code, but without documentation or structure around it, we won't often find out. We don't plan these junkyard situations. They're They just happen because of the time, the resources, and not asking ourselves, which direction are we going in? So when I saw that our GitHub organizations had reached a state of like bloating, many different stories being told in different languages, and some great projects and some not so great projects, it was very inconsistent and incoherent. So, what I wanted to say is, what if we focus on the narrative and the community and the audience and the world around us? Why don't we try to talk to them instead of talking to ourselves? Why don't we think about hygiene in our GitHub organizations to make sure that we're proud of all of this work, and if we're not, then we have a structure in place to improve it. And again, in this case, writers can be the dev's best friends, because we're able to put these stories together. 2 weeks ago, I was at SRECon, and Betsy Beyer of Google was giving a talk on this very topic, that how to work with technical writers. And she noted that we can whip documentation into shape, whether it's internal or external. We can help you find your way through your documentation so that users and contributors can get onboarded. We also know how to maintain docs long term. So as your story changes in your project, we can help you make note of that and then keep your documentation relevant. We can also structure and storytell through all of this work. So we've talked about storytelling and how we end up with GitHub junkyards. So now let's talk about the digging part, the bringing sanity to your GitHub story. It turns out that a lot of organizations end up in the same place as Zalando did 2 years ago, with lots of stuff on GitHub and not really being sure about what it was and why it was there. Oftentimes companies don't have a curator or a centralized open source program to curate what's on GitHub and develop a strategy. So then, they end up finding that they have this big bloated org and they don't know what to do with it. So I'll tell you what we did. So it's pretty fun. It took a lot of time, maybe about 6 months, to go through 400 repos and understand the patterns running throughout them. But it was kind of like an archaeological expedition where I've worked on finding the buried treasures and all of this. And I found some really great gems. So the idea then was, well, how do we make sure that the world, the internet, can find the gems simply and quickly? And how do we bury some of this other stuff that we're not so excited about? In all of this, the emphasis for me was making a sustainable open source culture that we were projecting online that emphasized quality and also basic storytelling so people could follow along. So I mentioned that we had the open source guild that had these guidelines that we kind of didn't pay attention to all the time. So one of the primary goals for me was to make sure that these these guidelines covered all the bases for open source development, from licensing to your README to what files you would need. And then I put it on GitHub so that not only we, but everyone else could see how we were doing open source development. Because there was this nature of that compulsion to publish among some members of the team, I didn't want to get into a political bloodbath at the time. So what the compromise was, instead of having them release their very embryonic projects to GitHub on the main organization, it's just /Zalando, where it would be like in the spotlight, create a separate organization called the Incubator and have them go send their projects there. And that's also where I started pushing all the other projects that were kind of abandoned or half finished. So it was kind of like an incubator graveyard, but it served the purpose of drawing attention away from some of that stuff and allowing the gems to shine in a brighter spotlight. So the guidelines would help developers kind of follow along with this organizational path, or this set of steps. So the best, strongest projects would, like I said, go on the main organization. And then Zalando Incubator was the incubator cemetery, and we called it coding in the open. A lot of this code was very coupled to our systems. Its use for others was pretty limited because you had to work at Zalando to really use it effectively. But it helped the developers with this drive to code, share code. It gave a compromise to that. And then with GitHub Enterprise, we're a huge client of theirs with 1,800 technologists we would be. So this is where we were really trying to push people to develop through inner source, which is an open source model but inside an organization. So encouraging that before you release this stuff, why don't you use the internal community of developers we have to get feedback, ask for user experience help, these kinds of things. A lot of what I was doing after cleaning up a lot of the stuff was teaching to templates. So the open source guidelines that we have, that I just showed you, have some templates for product analysis, README development, and there's even a pull request template to help you make effective pull requests. So the product analysis template is really where the most fun happens for me, because I'm finding that a lot of developers don't, they will release something but not be aware of where their project exists in the context of the GitHub universe, which is enormous. So the product analysis template emphasizes doing market research, asking why you're building this thing that you're building, finding where it belongs. Is it like project X, or is it unlike project X and it does Y thing instead? And understanding what is the purpose of this project. As part of this, I sometimes ask people to do something like this, which you can actually put in your docs. It's like a sample table to compare and contrast with similar projects, so that you understand what your value proposition is and what's unique about it. Then, asking developers to do user research, so understanding what to build, and working within a set of constraints established by fellow developers who might want the thing that you're offering, but want it to do certain things, and making sure that the project delivers those certain things, and then documenting it. For a lot of the most effective user research is asking people, fellow developers, interview questions, like sitting down with somebody one-on-one and asking them, like, would you use this? Why should it exist? Should it work? What are the pain points that you're experiencing, and how can I help you solve those with my thing? Taking this user research and this market research and then combining it into a user persona really is also a step that the product analysis template emphasizes to really help the developers see that, a person in mind when they're creating something. Or cats. Yes, we should develop for cats. And when you're done with all of this research, you can actually use this in your README. So what I find with my work in FeedMe READMEs and work with Zalando is that often it's like I could be a bot. The things that are missing from every README that I notice is like why this exists, what it's like, what it's not like, and why did I make this? When you have all that research available from users in the marketplace, you can actually tell that story fairly simply in your documentation, just at the beginning. And then someone can quickly understand what they're looking at and why they're looking at it, and why they should continue reading on and maybe even use this thing that they're looking at. Teaching this kind of stuff takes time. So patience is a virtue. Certainly spinning up templates, guidelines, new orgs, it's very fast. You can do that immediately. What's slow is, making a culture shift happen, where storytelling becomes something that not just those technical writers do, but what anybody can do. And this requires building trust, changing habits, changing the context. And but when it happens, it's very empowering because documentation brings sanity and coherence to our development cycles. It's not, liberating us from having to tell the same story over 10 times. Like, okay, first you must use this, then you must install that, and going through that repetition, to actually creating like a source of truth for what follows, and not only in a project repo, but even in a culture. So some of the documentation that we create isn't just a README or how to use something, it's also the strategy and the process documents in place to enforce these kinds of open source cultures. So in May 2017, we actually went ahead and took our guidelines that were kind of voluntary and created a whole strategy around it. And it clarifies the process. It includes these 101s, I call them, like contributor guidelines, security files, documentation. It makes them required because we saw that some devs weren't following them, and it's really, we needed to step it up and help them step up their game and make this more official so that they could build projects more successfully. So again, it's about creating structure. So we have a review group now, which is a peer review group. It's not just me anymore looking at all this stuff, but other developers, compliance, legal, security team, to make sure that the work that we put out there is high quality, coherent, useful. What we're seeing is that developers are catching on, and they're starting to work backwards with words. So there's different ways that teams do this, from developing a mock press release to already have that user in mind and like look at this project and see what it can do, like doing that before even developing something so that the customer is clear. We see that happening. We also see teams experimenting with README-driven development, so making a README file that kind of scopes out the vision of a project before setting about to code. And we see other things like inner sourcing taking place with early PRs to pull requests so that their feedback loop is tighter and faster. This is an example of some of this magic in action. So the team that created that set of components that I showed you earlier created this external DNS project for Kubernetes ingresses and services. And before they started coding, they went out to the community and said, like, we have this idea, what do you think? And the community said, that's a great idea. Why don't you put it in the Kubernetes Incubator? And so they were getting this feedback, and this is documentation too. It's just comments. But it all informed the story that they were telling. In closing, my biggest piece of advice is if you're a growing organization, clean up your GitHub organization as a habit and start now. Don't put it off. Keep pinging your users. Keep getting feedback on your projects to ensure that they're relevant and that the story you're telling is both accurate and makes sense, and also a story you feel passionate about. Read the docs, so not only just people's readmes, but we're actually seeing a growing body of literature that helps us develop open source projects, programs, and initiatives. This just went live yesterday. It's from the GoTo group, which is a consortium of all the household name companies we know. They just released these open source guides to help us all develop programs simply and quickly and avoid the pain. Also look on the bright side. Projects like Rust are getting very dedicated and focused on documentation. This is a whole set of help wanted requests around their documentation. There is a conversation happening that we're all part of. Read your Twitter as well. So there are a lot of people like Kelsey Hightower, Katrina Owen of GitHub, Victor Klang of TypeSafe, Lightbend. People who really value the work that we do and they see the importance of it for making open source projects successful. I sometimes feel like I'm a little bit of an echo chamber because everyone I know on Twitter loves documentation. I'm like, this is where I am existing. But there are actually a lot of developers that really value our work. And that's it. I am done. So if you have any questions, here's where I am. Thanks.